right, so as Prashant introduced me, my name is Siddharth. I work at the Simon Center at NCPS, and in my spare time, I also run a club called SciCommSci, which stands for the Science of Science Communication. Um, right, so today we're going to be talking about science communication as storytelling. And before I proceed, let me tell you a little story about myself. Once upon a time, I was a schoolboy who was sort of interested in science and humanities both, and I couldn't really pick between the two. By some serendipity, but I did not want to give exams like JEE and medical and stuff. So I was sort of a rebel who did not really want to give all these exams. But by some serendipity, I ended up at ISC. But even while I was at ISC, I couldn't really figure out what subject or branch of biology I wanted to take in. So I sort of graduated out of ISC and I wasn't sure what to do. So I thought, why not pursue my interest in humanities? And that's how I sort of gravitated back towards science communication. And cut to today, I've been working in the field for more than 4 years. I've worked in a couple of dozen places. And it's been a really, really nice journey. And I haven't really looked back and thought about going back to biology again. So the moral of the story is that this was a short story about myself. And today we are here to sort of, learn about the craft of storytelling, to understand how we can share our own stories and stories about our work, about our science, and about things that interest us, right? So without any further ado, let's begin. Right. So before we begin, I want you guys to do a short poll. So I want you to rate two questions or two statements on a scale of 1 to 10. The first question is science communication needs to incorporate stories. So I want you to rate it from 1 to 10, depending on how much you agree with it. And the second statement is how comfortable do you feel using storytelling in your science communication? So to do this, I want you to go to menti.com. Right here, this one, and enter this code 6728092. And I'll wait for a minute until you guys do this. All right, is everyone done?
Yes, sir.
Cool. So I'll wait for another 20 seconds, but if you can see my screen, you should be able to see that about the average score is about 7.9 in terms of science incorporating stories, and about 6.5 for people being comfortable using SciComm. Yes, you guys can see my screen?
Yes, sir.
All right, great. Okay, so I guess a few people will still keep on doing this, so we'll move on, right? So what's the plot for today, right? So what is the story that we're going to weave today, and what is it that we have in store for you guys today? So let's look at it. So first we're going to discuss, are science and stories antagonistic? Are they necessarily different, or can they be sort of integrated together? Next, we'll look at the question, does science really need stories? Then we're going to look at what can we learn from the craft of storytelling. We'll have some activities interspersed between these three sections. And the last section would be basically Q&A, where you guys can ask me anything that you want, right? All right. So when we hear the word science and stories, what comes to mind? So usually when we think of science, we think of objective. And when we think of stories, we think of subjective. When we think of science, the word fact and evidence comes to mind, whereas for stories, it's fiction, right? When we think of science, we think of accuracy and precision, but when we think of stories, we think of communicability, accessibility, engagement, but inaccuracy, right? So it's basically this association of fact versus fiction when we hear the word science and stories, right? But this is not necessarily true, right? There are a lot of ways in which science and stories can coexist. They can be integrated together, and they can sort of be, support each other, right? So it's not always the fact that science and stories are sort of antagonistic to each other, right? So I'm going to share a few points as to why I think that's the case. So here we go, right? So let us look at some of the elements of stories in scientific reports, right? So when I say a scientific report, I mean it could be a scientific publication, it could be a PowerPoint presentation that you're giving in a science talk, it could be an article that you have written, it could be a policy proposal, any kind of scientific writing that you do. Whereas when I say stories, sorry. So when I say stories, I'm talking about stories as we understand the word stories, but also popular forms of science communication like videos and articles, popular science articles, and the likes, right? So these are the two things that I mean by stories and scientific reports. Now let us look at some of the elements of scientific reports, right? Now we're all familiar with elements of scientific reports like introduction, literature review, methods, results, discussion, conclusion, right? They are sort of a part of all papers that we read. But when we think of stories or science communication, popular science communication, elements of those include character, context or background, plot and action, tension, resolution, and takeaways or the model at the end, right? Now you can see that there are certain things which are sort of familiar on both the sides, right? So for example, context and the background are sort of similar or overarching with each other, right? In the same way, plot, action, or methods are also very similar to each other. You can also think of resolution and discussions to be sort of overlapping, and also takeaways and conclusion, right? But these are some of the similarities, but then there are also a lot of differences, right? So then I'll talk about two main differences. The first difference between a scientific report and story is sequence, right? So when you look at a popular science article, very often, so when you look at a scientific report, the sequence that I have presented on the screen is pretty much the sequence in which most papers are written in, right? But when you look at a popular science articles, it's often the results of the discussion which are shared first. Then you talk about the background, and then probably towards the end, you talk about the methods, right? So the sequence in which all of these elements of stories and scientific reports are sort of juxtaposed to each other are very different, right? So that's one main key difference between stories and scientific reports. The other difference, the main key difference is audience, right? Now, scientific reports or scientific papers are mostly written for a scientific audience. And that's the reason why they use certain terminologies, they use certain terms, they use certain approaches or process or methods, which the audience is expected to know. But on the other hand, when you talk of stories or popular science communication, the audience can be varied. It could be a student sort of audience, it could be teachers, it could be a medical scientific article targeted towards patients, it could be towards doctors. So the audience of stories and popular science communication is very varied, right? And for that reason, the sequence and the order and the way in which all these elements are sort of put together also differs a lot in a story, right? So these are the two main differences between stories and scientific reports, right? Now, we all understand what are stories, right? But for the sake of discussion, for the sake of today's discussion, let me define what stories are, right? So stories are basically narratives that are designed to interest, amuse, or instruct the audience or reader, right? So they can invoke or incite interest, they can cause amusement, or they can also help people learn about new things, right? But the main key feature of stories that we should remember is that stories bring people together, right? Now, stories are one of the oldest forms of communication, and stories inherently are a way in which, when you are speaking to an audience, it automatically makes the audience interested in what you're saying, right? So stories are a great way of bringing people together for them to share experiences, to share meaning, to share lived expertise, and all of those things, right? On the other hand, storytelling is basically a way or an approach or a method to share and learn ideas, values, and practices, right? Now, I just want to define stories before we begin. There are three key elements of stories, right? So there are the three C's, right? So the first is content. Within content, you can also think of characters and whatever the story is about. The second is context or the background. What is the setting? What is the time? What is the period? What is the mood of the story, right? So that's the context of the story. And the last thing is connect, right? So how do you make a story relatable or engaging for the audience, right? So that aspect is called the connect of the story, right? So there are three C's in stories: content, context, and connect, that we need to remember for the rest of the presentation, right? Moving on. I think it's also important to sort of define science communication. Now, science communication has a lot of definitions. It has a lot of ways in which people sort of put together. Right. So science communication can be defined in many ways, right? But mostly science communication is a set of activities which incites the following responses, and this is called the vowel analogy. Science communication is any activity which invokes or elicits the following responses in the audience, right? So it could be about spreading awareness. So spreading awareness, say, about climate change. It could be about enjoyment. So the audience enjoys, for example, if you're doing a fun science experiment, you're enjoying. Invoking interest. So if you want people to get interested in something, for example, a new therapy or a new disease, That's also science communication. It could be about changing opinions. So it could be about whether people should be wearing masks or not wearing masks, right? So that's also a form of science communication. And lastly, it could be about understanding, right? So if you want to understand how does climate change work, or how does water boil, or how does gravity work, right? So if you want to understand phenomena around us, that's understanding, right? So any set of activities which invokes awareness, enjoyment, interest, opinions, or understanding is basically can be termed as science communication in a very broad sense, right? Now, the important thing about science communication, which most scientists especially sort of overlook, is that they are very, very particular about presenting facts and evidence accurately and precisely, but they often overlook or don't pay enough attention to creating emotional connections, right? Now, so science communication is both about presenting scientific facts and evidence, but also about creating emotional connections. It's as much as about spreading awareness and understanding as it is about making sure that the audience is enjoying and they're interested and you're changing their attitudes and opinions, right? So we need to remember that there are two aspects. One is presenting the science and the accuracy and the facts, but the other thing is also about the stories and the emotional connections and the interest, right? Lastly, science communication offers a way to bridge science and society, right? It's not just about scientists communicating the science to lay audiences or general audiences. It's also about scientists understanding what the audiences want. What is it that's happening in society? What are the motivations of people to engage in whatever science communication that they're trying to do, right? So it's sort of a bi-directional or a two-way, traffic that happens. So scientists learn a lot of things from the audience that they're engaging or they're trying to communicate the science to, but in turn, the audience also learns more things about science, right? But we need to remember that it's a two-way bridge between science and society, right? All right. So now let me ask the question, why does science need stories? So now I've written communication in bracket because when I say science, I also mean even if you're not communicating science to a general audience, even if you're communicating science to your peers who are also scientists, to a professor, to a scientific audience, it's still, you can still use stories and storytelling very effectively, right? Of course, science communication does need stories, but my question is, why does science and science communication both need stories, right? So I'm going to give you a couple of reasons as to why this is important, right? So the first reason why I think science needs stories is because science has credible stories, right? Now, scientists bear witness to unprecedented stories. There is so much drama, there's thrill, there's excitement, there is the joy of discovering new things, there is a lot of failures, there's a lot of conflicts and problems that they need to overcome, and it's about perseverance and hard work, right? So science itself has scientists bear witness to a lot of unprecedented stories, which most people, like I would say 90% of the population, will not be able to access these if scientists don't communicate them, right? The second reason is that science has a lot of engaging aspects and narratives built within it, right? So when you think about the discovery of DNA, when you think about how Copernicus discovered that the Earth moves around the sun and not the other way around, or how was radioactivity discovered, or how Archimedes sort of just ran out of his bathtub, right? So there are all very, very interesting stories within science, which makes science very fertile for storytelling. And if we don't use these stories when we are communicating our science, it's going to be a shame, right? So the first reason I think science needs stories is because science itself has incredible stories which are very fertile for storytelling. The next reason is for connecting with your audience in a much better way, right? Now, stories are a very primal way of social bonding, as I mentioned earlier. Stories allow us to, experience what the other person has experienced, for us to understand what the other person has gone through, and it allows us to empathize and, sympathize with other people, right? So stories allow us to find shared identities and context, and it's a very, very important tool for connecting with your audience, right? And if you are trying to communicate something, if you don't connect with your audience, your communication is not going to be complete, right? Stories also humanize the protagonist or storyteller. Now, scientists can often be thought of as very objective, cold-hearted, indifferent people who are just working in the lab in a lab coat. That's a cliched image of a scientist, right? But when you are a scientist trying to communicate your science, it's very important that the people sort of empathize and sort of relate to you, the person, as the scientist, as the storyteller, as the character in your story, who is undergoing a lot of things to be able to present the story to you, right? So stories allow the protagonist or the storyteller or the scientist to be humanized, right? Lastly, stories allow us to connect scientific ideas which might be abstract, which might be difficult to understand. They allow us to connect it and sort of overlap it with the interests and motivations and life experiences of the audience, right? So if you can connect whatever science you're talking about with the life experiences, with the interest, with the motivations of your audience, there's a much better chance that you will connect with the audience and your science communication would be much more effective, right? The next reason why science needs stories is because of cognitive factors, right? Now neuroscience research shows that mirror neurons were one of the most important developments in the human body, which allowed us to evolve as the human civilization, right? So mirror neurons are basically neurons which fire when we are trying to do any kind of motor action, or when when we see someone else doing the same motor action, right? So mirror neurons basically evolved as because of motor functions for us to learn motor functions very quickly, but very soon they also became to be used for empathizing, for sharing meaning, for processing information, and most importantly for learning new things quickly, right? So because of mirror neurons, if you are sort of sharing a story, the mirror neurons are much more likely to fire and the audience is much more likely to relate to your story, right? Stories also are much more easy to recall for your audience. They are much more easy to comprehend and they are much more easier to learn also, right? So if you're presenting new scientific information or facts, if you shape it or share it through a story, the audience is much more likely to learn it quickly and recall and comprehend it quickly. Uh, there is another cognitive bias that we have is that humans are, cognitively sort of biased towards understanding and interpreting things which are at the human scale of vision. So if we can see something, touch something, hear something, it's easier for us to understand it. But if it's something which is at the celestial or astronomical scale, or if something is at the microscopic or the atomic scale, it's more difficult for humans to sort of understand abstract concepts, right? So stories allow us to sort of anthropomorphize these abstract concepts by connecting or connecting them back to phenomena or objects or stories or experiences that is at the human scale, and that's why they make it easier for us to understand. For example, if you're to understand how things happen, how does a black hole function, or how does quantum mechanics work, right? It's inherently very difficult to understand. Right. Lastly, there is a lot of negative entanglement, which by negative entanglement, I mean that humans often sort of entangle negatively facts and evidence with personal identities and emotions. And this is something which we see all around us because we live in a world where fake news sort of, surrounds us everywhere, right? Now, all of these fake news, pseudoscience, superstitious, forwards on WhatsApp and everything, they all use storytelling and aspects of stories very, very effectively, which is why they're so much more convincing, right? Now, if we want to fight fake news and if we want to compete with this, we need to, as scientists, we need to learn how to use these elements of storytelling in our scientific communication also, right? Fake news especially often uses hooks like, conflict around us, or they'll say that something is brand new, it's very novel, or they'll talk about geographical or cultural proximity. If something is close to us, we are much more likely to care. If something is happening in Bangalore or India, we'll care much more than if it's happening in Europe, right? Also, if it's personally relevant to you, if it's about a medical condition that you have, or if it's in some way personally relevant to you, it's much more easier for news to reach you and for you to get affected, right? But at the same time, using stories also has an ethical dimension to it, which means that if you're using all of these storytelling tactics and hacks and tips and tricks, we need to make sure that we're using it to communicate the right amount of science, which is why as scientists, we need to learn these storytelling methods and craft for us to be able to use it ethically and share the right information with others. Lastly, any kind of communication is built on trust and relationships. So if you want your audiences to trust you as opposed to a fake news media outlet, the most important thing is to build trust and relationships over a long period of time, and that only happens when you sort of engage with the audiences that you want to engage with over a longer period of time, and not just when you need to do something immediately, right? So another reason for using stories is it will help you personally, professionally develop as a scientist, right? So if you use stories, you can write, you're much more likely to write more impactful papers, deliver more engaging presentations, prepare more compelling proposals and reports, convince prospective employers to hire you. influence policymakers if you want to affect change in society, and most importantly, change public opinion, right? Oftentimes, scientists are trying to tell the public that this is right and this is wrong, but the public does not really listen. And that's not because they don't trust the scientists or they don't want to listen. It's because the scientists are not putting in enough effort to make sure that their message is being communicated effectively, right? So if you learn the use of storytelling, you can do all of these things much better. Lastly, I want to ask you guys, why do you do science? So what's the reason you do science? You can type in your answers in the chat box and I can take a look. I'll give you a minute to sort of type in. So don't write in long answers. I just want you to write in one phrase or one line. What is the reason do you do science? What's the motivation? What is it that you're interested in science? What drove you or encouraged you to pursue science, right? And if you're not a scientist, you can write why you're interested in science in general, right? So I'm going to give you guys a minute to write in the chat box why you're interested in science. Okay. Okay. So Nitisha says it's interesting. Shashwat says, I believe I can make an impact using science. Great. So while you guys continue writing, I'm going to move on in the interest of time. Right. So as Nitisha and Shashwat have shared that, it is interesting, it can help you make an impact on science. Storytelling in science can also allow scientists to introspect what they're doing, right? So it helps scientists articulate why they became scientists, why are they interested in the field that they're working in, why is their work important, what is their personal and professional motivations, how can they help society, improve by treating a medical disease or, improving, inventing some kind of technology which can improve society. So there are various reasons why scientists do. Now it's important. All right, so we have a few more examples. So Abhipsa says discovering new things. Sarvagya says I'm bad at other subjects. Great, because we can discover new things. Arunima says. Janishka says science is interesting. Cool, right. So these are all very, very important introspective motivations of why you do science. And the reason I asked you to articulate why are you interested in science is because I want you guys to understand that you can use these very reasons in your science communication, right? So when you're communicating your science, you need to put yourself at the center because you're the protagonist, you're the person who is doing the science or is discovering something new. And it's very important for you to sort of share your personal motivations, personal and professional motivations as to why are you interested in science, right? So basically, storytelling allows us to focus on the process of science as much as focus on the concept or the scientific fact that we're trying to communicate. And it's very important to also focus on the process of science, right? So these were some of the reasons why we sort of need stories in science. Now, I'll end with this cartoon, which basically sums up what I was trying to say. So I'll just read this out in case people are not able to, read it out. So there's this scientist. She says peer-reviewed papers are our bread and butter. They create knowledge and validate what we do. But our bread and butter can be difficult to digest. It is so dense and so dry that no amount of chewing can make it tasty, right? So then she thinks, so we can chew tasteless bread because we have to be objective. We can't be objective and tasty at the same time. That's sensationalism, right? And that is often what we see in news media outlets, right? So science is sort of overblown, hyperbolic, sensationalized versions of what the actual science is, right? But there is a catch. But we can with ingredient X, right? Now, X contains creativity, clarity, and narrative, right? Ingredient X makes our readers want our bread and butter without compromising on its integrity, right? So you're not really compromising on the accuracy and the precision and the integrity of the science, but you're just adding some additional elements to your science communication, which makes it more interesting, right? So she says in the end, this way the bread is eaten, enjoyed, and digested. Yeah, right. So basically, I'm trying to say that you can combine science and stories together very, very carefully. And today's presentation is exactly how do we do that, right? So let's proceed. All right. So we're going to look at some storytelling strategies. Right. So let's look at another cartoon, which is by Animate Your Science. Now, imagine you're a scientist who's trying to give a PowerPoint presentation to a bunch of your colleagues and other professors and scientists, right? So you want to tell them a story, but how do you avoid using the standard boring presentation, right? So the diagram says a presentation is coming up. Which kind of presentation are you going to give, right? Now, the first panel of the comic says the standard list-like presentation. So the scientist is giving a PowerPoint presentation and says, hello, my name is Dr. Smart and I do research on XYZ. This is my first graph and this is my second graph and these are my conclusions, right? So now what do we see? That this was an and type presentation, right? He says one fact, he says another fact, and he says another fact, and the presentation gets over, right? Now this is a boring list of facts. It does not really tell a story, and it has no narrative structure. Probably not the way to go, right? Now what's the alternative to this? What's the alternative to this? We can use another approach of telling a story, the engaging story, right? So then again, this person says, hello, my name is Dr. Supersmart, and today I'm going to tell you a story. We knew this and that, but we really didn't understand how this worked. Therefore, we did this experiment and found that this is important because blah, 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 right? Now, in this version of telling the story, this was an interesting story because it used the and, but, therefore type presentation. It was engaging, it told a story, and it had a narrative structure, right? Now, this is probably the way to go, right? So the person basically sets up the background, then using and, then he says, but, then he introduces a problem or a conflict or some amount of drama, and then he resolves the drama by using therefore, when he says, therefore we did this and we solved this problem, and that's how we got to this, right? Now, this is a very small tweak to what he did, right? So when you're using an and versus an and, but, therefore, there's a very small thing that you did. That's basically introduce a conflict and then you resolve that conflict, right? Now, this introduction of conflict resolution pairs in your science communication is called narrative structure, right? They can be called conflict resolution pairs, or they can basically give you a narrative structure, right? So and, but, therefore are basically the basic building blocks of any narrative, right? So and signifies agreement, but signifies contradiction, and therefore signifies consequence. You can also look it up as setup or the introduction or the background. Then there's a problem, and then there's a solution, right? So basically, we use these conflict resolution pairs, which are fundamental to any story, and we can use them multiple times in repetitions in different patterns to sort of add more narrative element or narrative structure to a science communication, right? Now, it's a very simple thing to do, right? And you will see this and, but, therefore in almost everything around you, be it films, books, television, speeches, ads, journalism, all of this is, you can see all of these things around you. Like you name it and you'll see around you. Cool. Now, there's another way of looking at narrative structure, which is called the narrative spectrum. Now, if you look at this diagram, you can see the and structure is basically boring and non-narrative. If you include a little bit of and, but, and therefore, it becomes narrative and interesting. But if you include too many despite, however, but, yet, all of these things, it becomes overly narrative and confusing, right? So ideally, you want a good balance of and, but, and therefore in your stories, right? And you don't want too much despite, however, yes, because then it becomes very contradictory and confusing, right? Now, how do we measure this narrative structure or spectrum? There's a very simple way of doing it, which is basically counting the number of buts in whatever science communication you're doing, dividing it by the number of ands, and multiplying it by 100 to get a percentage, right? Now, this is not a solution to everything to make your science communication interesting. It's a very crude measure of, measuring what is the narrative structure or narrative element or narrative index of your science communication. It could be an article, it could be a presentation. There's a very simple way of doing it, right? Instead of buts, you can also consider words like however, despite, yet, although instead, because they serve the same function as but, right? So it doesn't have to be but I think if you count the number of buts and ands in any piece of writing that you come across, it's a straightforward way of measuring the narrative index, right? Now, I can see. So I asked you guys to bring a scientific paper and a popular science article with you. Now, if you have it with you on a computer, I want you to do a quick exercise, which is basically do in Control F and just type in the word and note the number of ands that are there in that piece of paper and popular science article, and then note the number of buts that are there, and just calculate this narrative index as I have shown on the screen, right? So I want you to calculate the narrative index for the scientific paper and a popular science article, right? And while you do this, and you can post the answers on the chat box, right? So I'll give you 2 minutes. It shouldn't take too much time because it's just doing a Control F and searching for the words button and, right? All right. So 2 minutes to do this, and we'll look at what the results are. All right. I'll move on in the interest of time. So in case you didn't get a paper, I have a few examples. All right. So I can see some people have posted some numbers, which looks interesting. I'll leave it to you guys to sort of interpret if there is a difference between the narrative index for a scientific paper versus the narrative index for a popular science article. Now, I have a few examples in case you didn't bring a paper. Now this is a machine learning paper, and I calculated the narrative index. So there were 7 buts and 54 ands, and so that comes out to about 13% as the narrative index, right? All right, so I can see Abhipsa has shared a narrative index of Popular Science article as 30 and paper as 3.9. That's almost a 10-fold difference. That's interesting. All right, so I'll share these a few examples with you. So this machine learning paper has a narrative index of about 13%. If you look at the classic iconic discovery of DNA paper by Watson and Crick, the narrative index is about 24%, and that's almost double of the machine learning paper. And this is not surprising because the story of the discovery of DNA was kind of very, very iconic, and it's obvious that the paper will also have certain narrative aspects, right? Now, if you look at Romeo and Juliet by Shakespeare, that's a classic story that we are all familiar with. The narrative index of that is 33%, which is pretty high, right? And that's not surprising again, because of course it has a lot of drama and stories and narratives built into it. Excuse me. Lastly, there's this article called War in the Womb by Suzanne Saturday. And this is one of my favorite pieces of science journalism. And the narrative index of this is 44%, which is even higher than Romeo and Juliet, which basically is there to give you guys hope that a popular science article can be narrative. It doesn't have to be always less than popular stories like Romeo and Juliet. So you can see that even scientific pieces of writing can incorporate stories and integrate them very well. So I would recommend everybody to read this article. It's in the Aeon magazine. It's called War in the Womb, which basically talks about how pregnancy is not an altruistic phenomena. It's actually a war between the mother and the placenta inside the womb. And it's a fascinating piece of article. And if anybody wants to get into science journalism, I would highly recommend reading this article. Right. So now we can see that there's a difference in narrative index from a machine learning paper to the discovery of DNA paper to Romeo and Juliet to another really good piece of scientific writing. Right. So let's move on now. Now, let's talk about narrative arcs, right, or a plot diagram. So narrative arcs are basically a structure of events, a series of events structured to ensure drama, right? Now we talked about, at the beginning of my presentation, we talked about various elements of stories, right? We had character, context, resolution, conflict, all of those things. Now, if you have to arrange these things in a series or a structured way to ensure drama, that's what is called a plot diagram or a narrative arc, right? Now, narrative arcs usually follow a hero or the protagonist or the character's journey in order to facilitate empathy, emotions, and engagement in the audience that are listening to the story. Right. Now, a key aspect of storytelling to remember is to unfold it, not dump it, right? You want to take your time to slowly reveal, build up the suspense, take the readers or the audience on a journey where you're telling them things slowly, and then there is, things being revealed as you go along the story. So basically you unfold the story, don't dump it all together, which is probably how scientific papers are, mostly. Right. So after this, let's look at an example of a plot diagram or a narrative arc. Now, in a narrative arc, the first sort of section is the exposition. Exposition is basically the introduction to the story, its characters, its protagonists, the context of the story, the mood, the time, the setting, all of those things. So you basically describe what the story is about, who is it about, who is the character, and what is happening in the story, right? So you set a baseline for your audience to get familiar with, and then you introduce a conflict in the story, right? Now, a conflict is basically the primary problem which drives the story's plot, right? So after you introduce the conflict, you sort of keep building the action, and there is a series of rising action events, which basically leads you to the climax. Now, the rising actions are basically all the events that lead to the eventual climax. Now, what is the climax? The climax is the story's peak of excitement, often at an inflection point. So that's the height of drama or tension in the story, which you build up slowly in the rising action. Once you reach the climax and things start resolving, and then you have a series of falling action, right, where things start getting resolved, everything starts getting back into place. You're tying all the threads, and things sort of all the questions that you had raised during the conflict and the rising action sort of get answered in the story, right? And the last bit is basically resolution, where you basically give a resolution or a conclusion. It can be a happy, sad, abstract conclusion to the story, and you sort of tie up all the threads, all the loose threads that are there in your story, and you also share a moral or the conclusion of the story in the end, right? So this is how most stories work, right? So there is an exposition, there is a conflict, there's rising action, there's falling action, there's climax, falling action, and then there's resolution, right? Now, don't worry about these terms. I mean, what I want you guys to focus is basically the way that the plot is moving, right? So you have a baseline here. then things, so this is basically the y-axis is tension, right? So the tension, and the x-axis is time, right? So with time, the tension is sort of increasing. It reaches an inflection point with the climax, and then it starts decreasing, and then it reaches back to the baseline where the story started, right? So in some ways, you can see that this is basically a full circle, right? Now, another way to look at a narrative arc or a plot diagram is a hero's journey, right? Now, this is a slightly more involved or complex or detailed version of the plot diagram that I shared. So I'll give you an example. I think that's easier. So let's, I'm assuming everybody is familiar with Harry Potter. So let's take the example of Harry Potter, right? Now there's, Harry Potter is in the ordinary world. He lives with the Dursleys, right? And then he gets a call to adventure, right? He gets that letter from Hogwarts. But then there is refusal because his uncle and aunt don't allow him to go to Hogwarts because they're scared. Then there is a mentor or helper, basically someone comes along, Hagrid comes along. Sorry, I forgot that for a moment. So Hagrid comes along and helps Harry to, get ready for his journey to Hogwarts. And then Harry basically crosses the platform 3/4, and he gets into the Hogwarts Express and he goes to Hogwarts. When he's at Hogwarts, he meets a lot of allies. He meets a lot of friends, enemies. He meets Ron, Hermione, Malfoy. He faces a lot of tests, and there's a lot of events which are happening until the final, the main event of the story, which is basically Harry trying to find where the Sorcerer's Stone is hidden, right? He finally reaches the chamber where it's hidden, and he has to face the biggest ordeal in the story, which is the climax, which is his fight with Voldemort, right? He faces that ordeal, defeats Voldemort, and finally gets the reward, which is the Sorcerer's Stone, and he gets to go back to his friends, right? Now, in the road back, he meets Dumbledore again and sort of tries to understand what was going on, and then there is atonement where basically Gryffindor wins the House Cup, and then he returns back to Hogwarts Express and then back to his uncle and aunt's place, and that's the end of the story, right? So this is another sort of way of looking at a narrative where a hero sort of goes on an adventure. There's a call to adventure, there is an ordeal or initiation, then there is a transformation, and then there's a road back or hero's return, right? So this is another way of looking at how a narrative arc progresses, right? Now, I think I've shared enough theory and terms and terminologies with you. Now, let's get to an activity where we can practice this, right? So, I guess all of you have got a sheet of paper and pen. Now, on that sheet of paper and pen, I want you to make 6 boxes, basically, and label them as exposition, conflict, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. I want you guys to take 5 minutes and think of whatever scientific project that you're working on. If you are working on a scientific project, or whatever scientific story or journey or scientist that you sort of like, you can talk about their story. Or if you're not a scientist, you can just talk about a story that you have read about in science, a science story, right? I want you to sort of quickly make like stick figures of the scientific story and what's going to happen in the exposition or the introduction, the conflict, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and the resolution, right? So these are 6 things. If you can draw these things, great. If you can't draw them, you can just write down in words what is going to be. And I want you guys to think about who is the character, what is the main conflict, what's the climax, and what's the resolution or the moral of the story. What's the take-home message that you guys want to think about, right? Now, I'll give you 5 minutes and I'll let you do this on the sheet of paper. It doesn't have to be a very detailed drawing. It can just be a few words, or it can be stick figures, whatever you're comfortable with. And because I think you can share it with me. My social media handle is there at the bottom. You can share these images with me after the presentation, after the talk today, using this handle, right? So I'll take a look at it and respond to it after the talk. Probably not today in the interest of time. So, all right. So 5 minutes to you guys to do this quickly. All right. So let's move on. If you want to share the storyboard that you have drawn with me, you can tag me on social media and share it with me later. And I'll definitely respond to your storyboard later after the talk, right? So let's move on in the interest of time. Cool. So the next thing I want you to think, now that we have all tried to sort of, I'm sure you would have had some difficulties in trying to figure out who is your character, what's the conflict, what is the model or the take-home message of your story. And I'm sorry, I understand that this is not something you can do in 5 minutes, but I just wanted you guys to experience what it feels like to kind of try to, bracket all of these elements within these 6, boxes. And it takes a little bit of time and thinking to kind of figure out what's the best. And so based on your experiences of trying to do that storyboard, there are a few more things that we need to think about when we are trying to share a story about a science, right? But the first thing I want you guys to think about is signposting, right? Now, signposts are basically, basically signboards or signposts that guide your audience, right? Now, the signpost could be something like at the beginning of my presentation, I shared an agenda where I said that we're going to do these sections. So it could be a signpost like that. It could be a signpost which says that now it could be a metaphor or an analogy, or it could be a character that you keep referring back to within your story. It could also be benchmarks in the scientific journey. So, for example, in your scientific journey, you had a presentation where someone gave you a comment, and that led to a lot of new thinking on the project. So that is a benchmark in the scientific journey itself, right? Or you could say that you submitted a paper and it got rejected, and the reviewer gave you some comments, and that was sort of a key aspect in the story which helped you to think about your project in a new light, right? So these are benchmarks in the scientific journey itself, right? Which are very, very fertile for using in the story itself, right? Because they sort of put the protagonist or the scientist or you in the center of the story, and people can relate with your failures or your problems or your conflicts much more if you're sharing these personal anecdotes, right? So you can use you can use anecdotes from your scientific journey also as benchmarks. Secondly, ignorance of the characters is a great narrative element, right? So, for example, you can tell your audience that you have discovered a sort of a compound which cures cancer, right? Now, you know that you have discovered this, your audience knows because you have told them. But when you're telling a story, you can go back in the past and say that at this point of time, the scientist or the people working on it, or I who was working on it, did not know this, right? So you're basically sharing with them that the character in the story is ignorant of this fact, which we all know, right? And this is a great way of getting the audience more involved and engaged in your presentation, because they know what the truth is, you know what the truth is, but the character in the story or the protagonist does not know that. So the ignorance of the characters, and this really fits well into a scientific story, because oftentimes science is about finding new things, right? It's about solving a problem or proving a hypothesis, right? So using the ignorance of your characters in the story, in the past or future or present, can be a great narrative element also, and that can also be a signpost. The key thing to remember here is that you want to take your audience on a journey, and you want to make them aware that they're going on a journey, and you want to give them periodic reassurances or validations that they are progressing gradually along the journey, right? If they feel like they're stuck, if you start explaining some scientific concept for very, very long, they feel like they're stuck on the journey and they lose interest. But if you keep moving at a gradual pace and you keep interspersing the science and the story together, they feel like they're moving ahead and they sort of want to go on their journey with you, right? So the key thing to remember is that you want to take them on a journey, right? The next thing, as I said, is to keep the story moving, right? Now, can anyone say, can anyone guess what is this? Again, you can either speak or you can type in the chat box. Anyone wants to take a guess? What is this?
The sunflower.
Yeah, you're right. Some people may not have figured out that it's a sunflower pollens or stamens, whatever. But what I'm trying to say here is that sometimes the devil is not in the details. The devil is it's better to sort of give the overall picture. So when you are communicating to a general audience or a non-scientific audience, it's very important to sort of give them a bird's eye view of the scientific problem or the scientific story, and not get into the details very soon, right? You can get into the details a little bit later after you get into the story. So it's important to sort of, draw them into your story gradually, right? Don't start with explicit details or by defining a gene or a marker or, something, and that will basically not interest your audience, right? So the other thing is that we don't cherry pick our data, but you can cherry pick your anecdotes, right? And you have to do it responsibly, right? So in your scientific journey, there's a lot of detail that is there, right? You cannot start sort of from the beginning into the end as it happened, right? Sometimes you need to pick out the most interesting anecdotes or most interesting experiences in your scientific journey to put into your story, right? Now, if you remember, there are various elements in a story, right? But how you order those elements and how you put them together, how do you make conflict resolution pairs, or how do you make and but therefore sequences in your story multiple times, that also is very important. So sometimes it's important to leave out some details. So for example, in a scientific paper, you can talk about the results and the introduction, but you might choose to leave out the methods or the details of the methods a little bit. You might choose to leave out some of the literature review, but you might want to focus more on the discussion or the implementation or what is the application of that science, right? If it's an application-based science, of course, right? So sometimes you need to leave out some details and pick certain things. So you can cherry pick your anecdotes, even though you can't cherry pick your data. Again, it's very tempting to start from the start of your scientific journey and go towards the end. you don't really need to follow a linear timeline when you're telling a story. You can go back and forth. You can start with the end, go back in time, and come back to the future. You can play with the past, present, and future in order to craft a story which is more compelling, which is more engaging, which is more appealing, right? So it's okay to have non-linear timelines in your story. You don't have to literally follow a linear timeline in your story, right? The other thing is that you need to oscillate between the science and the storytelling, right? So you start with the story, you introduce a character, you get the audience interested in your story, then you give a bite-sized dose of a scientific concept or explain a scientific fact or introduce a new scientific concept that the audience may not know. But if you go on explaining the science for too long, the audience gets disinterested, right? So you need to keep oscillating harmonically between the storytelling and the science in such a way that the science is bite-sized and it's given in short intervals and it's given at periodic intervals, right? So it's very important to kind of have an overall overarching narrative or structure, but include science and scientific facts and concepts wherever it's necessary for the story to make sense, right? Again, remember ABT or the conflict resolution pairs. You can really, even if you want to include details of your science, you can actually make sure that the detail is included in conflict resolution pairs or and but therefore sequences in such a way that it becomes more interesting. So there are lots of ways of keeping the story moving, right? Okay, so how are we doing on time? Okay, it's almost 5. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about is the chronology of events, right? So we looked at the structure, we looked at the narrative arc, but time plays a very important role in the chronology of your story, right? Now, look at this graph, right? So this is not a story. The x-axis is basically time from start to end, and the y-axis is basically the character's fortune. The positive y-axis is prosperity of the character. Someone is really happy. And the negative y-axis is despair, right? Or someone's not happy, right? So on an average day, when you just had breakfast or you just, went and did your work, there's nothing interesting. So that's not really a story. But science can have lots of chronological, sequences of, elements of stories, right? Now let's look at discovery, right? So science has a lot of discoveries. Now, how about we think about say the duality of light. So when light was discovered as a particle, there was some amount of prosperity or happiness in the scientific community, but it did not fit well with a lot of experimental results. So then there was some despair because it did not seem like a good model. Then the wave nature of life was discovered and there was some prosperity again, but then again it did not validate a lot of experimental data. So there was some amount of despair. But soon the dual nature of light was discovered and it sort of was able to explain most of the experimental data out there. And then there was a huge increase in the prosperity of the scientific community, right? Similarly, if you look at the discovery of DNA, Linus Pauling discovered the DNA, wrong structure of the DNA. There was some excitement, but then it did not fit the data. Then sort of Watson and Crick proposed something, it did not really fit in. But then finally, Franklin and Wilkins basically, got the X-ray, photograph 51 X-ray crystallography image of DNA, and finally the structure of DNA was solved, right? So there is a little bit of up and down, a flip-flop between prosperity and despair until the final discovery happens, right? So this could be one chronology of scientific elements of a scientific story that you can use. Another example could be rescue. Now, the best example of this is the COVID-19 pandemic, right? We were all doing quite happily and prosperously before the pandemic. The pandemic came, there was a huge amount of despair. And then finally, when the vaccine comes in, we're all, it's safe to go out again. Hopefully, there will be some amount of repair of that despair and we'll be back to our prosperous times, right? Another example is climate change. Until a few decades ago, climate change was not existent or not recorded. We were doing fine. Then gradually we started, getting more worried about climate change. And finally, when we discover some green energy or, some way to solving the climate change, we might come back to, sort of a rescue, right? So a scientific timeline or chronology can also look at like this, like a rescue. Lastly, there could be mystery, right? An example of this is, say, gravitational waves, right? Now, Einstein predicted the existence of gravitational waves, but there was no experimental data to kind of explain it. So there was some amount of despair. But then finally, last year, when gravitational waves were finally detected and the existence of gravitational waves was proved by LIGO and Virgo, there was a huge amount of prosperity in the scientific community, right? So these are different ways in which you can structure and sequence the narrative elements together. And so there is no one fit model for how you need to structure your story, right? So it could be a story of discovery, it could be a story of rescue, it could be a story of mystery. There could be many more examples of this. I just wanted to share like 3 of them with you. So you understand that you can actually play around with all of these elements and come up with a structure and a chronology that suits the story that you want to share the best, right? All right. So I hope I'm clear so far. Next thing that I want to talk about is metaphors and analogies. Now, metaphors and analogies are very important. So when you think of, say, the vesicular transport system in the Golgi or the Golgi apparatus, you often, use the metaphor of a transport or a traffic network to explain it. When you talk about the mitochondria, you use an analogy of a powerhouse or a metaphor of a powerhouse to explain it, right? So metaphors and analogies are a great way for us to sort of understand abstract concepts in science and give them more tangential or more non-abstract, more concrete forms. So it helps us understand things better. So here's an example. So when electricity was first discovered, it was sort of an abstract concept that most people did not understand. But when electric circuits were sort of compared with water systems or a system of pipes of water, it was easy. So then they could compare or use the metaphor of pipe for wire, or pipe and wire were analogous. Pump or battery were analogous again between water and electricity. Pressure was analogous to voltage, narrowness to resistance, and flow to current, right? So when we say the flow of electricity, right, it's basically a metaphor, an analogy that was derived from a system of pipes of water, which has become so ubiquitous in our common everyday language that we don't even think about it. But it is actually an analogy that was sort of used in order to make the concept of electricity flowing in a wire much more easier to understand, because that's something we could not see or understand conceptually. So that's how a metaphor was used, right? So in a sense, a metaphor basically helps scientists visualize the invisible, bringing into focus useful details while blurring out others, right? So there are lots of caveats when you use metaphors. A metaphor may not be scientifically accurate if you stretch it too far. So it's very important for you to sort of mention to your audience or whoever you're talking to say that this metaphor extends to this point where I want you to understand this aspect or this feature of the scientific concept or object that I'm talking about. But this does not mean the metaphor is valid, is a valid approximation for everything about that scientific object or concept, right? So it's very important to describe the caveats in your metaphor when you are using a metaphor. And so it's important to be careful when you use metaphors and analogies in your science communication, right? The next thing, this is the second last thing I'll talk about. So the next thing I want you guys to think about is using hooks, right? Now, hooks are basically any aspects of the story which grab our attention and appeal to us emotionally. Now, some examples of hooks may be images, diagrams, or videos. It could be quotes from famous people. It could be questions or dilemmas. Now, you see that the agenda that I had shared at the beginning of my presentation, I shared questions in all of them, right? I did not write statements. I shared questions so that you guys think about those questions, right? So that was a hook in some ways. Analogies I just talked about, it could be anecdotes, it could be games or props or activities. It could be wordplay, it could be rhyming stuff, it could be figures of speech, it could be a joke or humor, right? But it's again important to remember that when you're using a hook, it doesn't need to be sensationalist or hyperbolic, right? So when you read in the newspaper that this compound has been discovered which can cure cancer, so one week you read that chocolate, helps cure cancer. The next week you read something which says chocolate causes cancer. And the next week you read coffee causes cancer, and then the next week you read coffee cures cancer, right? So this kind of sensationalist headlines in the news is something we see very often, and it's something that we as scientists and science communicators need to be very careful about. That when we use hooks, they should be realistic, they should be accurate, and they should be honest, and they should not over promise or overreach what the article or the science communication is about, right? So I have a cartoon for you to sort of remember that. So when you see a claim that a common drug or vitamin kills cancer in a petri dish, keep in mind, so does a handgun, right? So you need to be careful about using hooks because they can be taken out of context and they can be dishonest in some ways, right? Now, the last element of storytelling, or the last aspect of storytelling I want you to remember, is framing. Now, we have talked about stories and the elements and how do you structure them and what's the timeline and the chronology. But a very important thing in scientific storytelling, especially, is the way you frame your story, right? What is the background or the context in society that you use to share your story, right? Now, strategically framing your story to ensure maximum audience engagement is a very crucial thing, right? But you need to be very careful about how you use these frames and what kind of frames you use and what are the implications of these frames that you're using. So, for example, if you look at GM crops, right, or genetically modified food, oftentimes people who are anti-science, use this metaphor of Frankenfood, which is basically a Frankenstein. So basically food that has been altered in a way that it's scary, it causes diseases, it causes cancer. So this framing of GM crops is something from an anti-science point of view, where it looks very scary. On the other hand, you can again frame GM crops from the point of view of saying that these crops or these food items have been genetically altered in order to increase their nutritional value, right? And that comes from a medical or a therapeutic framing point of view, right? And that can be a very positive way of framing GM crops, right? Now, so when you are, debating with someone in the media who's trying to use a Frankenfood version of GM crops, you need to sort of switch back to using more, useful ways of framing, right? So that's the implication of the framing that you're using in your science communication. Now, this cartoon says, this old man says, I died waiting for an embryonic stem cell research to find a cure. What about you? So I'm presuming this guy had some disease which could have been cured by a stem cell. This baby or a kid here says, I was the embryo, right? Now, so you can frame the science around stem cells by saying that it cures a disease which can be cured by stem cells, but you can also frame the story from a model point of view where you talk about human rights and reproductive rights, and you can say that stem cells are not ethical because they sort of harvest embryos to continue this research, right? Now again, there are two alternate ways of framing stem cell research, and it's very important that you be careful about which framing you're using in your science communication, because they have much more far-reaching and longer-term implications than you might realize when you're just sharing your story, right? Another example could be that science can be pro development and economic development. So Santa here says, excuse me, sir, do you have experience in pulling a sleigh? He asked that to a walrus, and this is basically depicting climate change. Now, someone who's anti-science can say that, science is, very pro-economic development, and it's helping companies like Shell, get more profits at the expense of our environment. On the other hand, someone can say that science is helping us develop new, greener technologies, and it will help solve climate change in the long run. And so it can be a pro-environment framing also, right? So you can frame science from a pro-morality, pro-research, pro-climate, or pro-environment point of view, right? So it's important that you understand how you're framing your story, right? So I think this brings us to the end of whatever I had to share. Now, here are some resolutions or takeaway messages or morals of the story that we have been engaging in today. The first thing I wanted to remember is that in a narrative or in a story, there are three important things. The first is character. Now, we talked about character. The character could be the protagonist, which could be the scientist. It could be, so scientist could be you or another scientist that you're talking about. It could be a scientific object. For example, it could be a molecule that will cure some disease, or it could be the structure of DNA that you're trying to decipher, right? So it could be, the protagonist could be a scientific object also, right? It could be a patient who will benefit from a scientific research that will cure some disease. It could be society who will benefit from the application of that science, right? So the protagonist does not always have to be a person. It can also be abstract things like scientific objects or society in general, right? The next thing we talked about is now the choice of metaphors and analogies that you use in your story is very intricately interdependent on the character that you choose. So once you choose your character, you also choose your metaphors and analogies and imagery accordingly. The next thing is, again, the hooks that you use also will depend on the character and the metaphors you're using. So these are the aspects of character that I want you to remember when you're trying to develop a story about your scientific research. Also, you need to remember who is your audience, right? Now, if you are talking to an audience which is a school-going audience or like a 10-year-old, kids, you will use much more cartoon or animation or visual kind of hooks and metaphors. But if your audience is patients, you will use much more serious analogies and visuals for your presentation, right? So it also depends on the audience. The next thing I want you to look at is causality. Now, causality is nothing but the problem resolution pair or the and but therefore structure that we talked about. It's important to think about your story from the point of view of problem resolution pairs, because this problem resolution pair is a fundamental human construct which we are hardwired to understand much more easily. So if you can frame your science not just as one problem and resolution, but it could be multiple small things, right? It could be one aspect that you were trying to do this experiment, it failed, therefore you tried a new approach and then it worked, right? So it could be as small as that, right? Or it could be as big as, I tried discovering a cure to cancer, I did not fail, that's why I gave up, or therefore I discovered something, right? So these problem resolution pairs can be really micro or they can be really macro. It really depends on how you want to use them. The next thing is, again, using narrative structures in drama. I think it's the same thing as problem resolution phase. The way you frame your story, again, really depends on what kind of narrative structures you're using. Also, the anecdotes that you're picking from your scientific journey will also be dependent on the causality of events or what follows each other. And lastly, you need to oscillate between the science and the storytelling in such a way that it does not lose the flow of the narrative, but at the same time also explains the scientific concepts when it is important to explain them in the story itself, right? The last aspect of narratives or storytelling that I want you to remember is temporality, which is basically the rise and fall of emotions, right? So we saw the chronology of events that happened in the graphs that I showed you, whether it's a scientific discovery, it's a mystery or a rescue. So the rise and fall of emotions in your audience is very important for you to consider when you are trying to craft a story out of your scientific journey. The character's journey is also important. And you can use narrative arcs and you can use different versions of narrative arcs. If you search the internet, you'll find many more variations and types of narrative arcs that you can use. There are much more complex and involved things that you can do once you become comfortable using these basic things that I talked about today. Lastly, you need to signpost and make sure that your audience knows they're going on a journey and that they are progressing on a journey. It's very important to keep your audience in loop with the fact that they are progressing gradually in the journey. Lastly, the chronology, as I mentioned, is also important, right? So if you don't take back anything from the presentation, I want you to remember that a story about your scientific journey, you have to remember about the character, about the causality, and the temporality in your story, right? So lastly, I want to sort of share this yin yang of SciComm. So we often think of science and stories as strictly different or opposing to each other, as I said in the beginning. So science is often thought of as accurate, non-emotive, relevant, formal, objective, impersonal, linear, and concise, right? So this is inaccessible but accurate. So this is scientifically accurate but probably not accessible. So an example of a headline that was used in the newspaper was the differential locomotory response of mammalian and reptilian taxa to interspecific competition, right? Now, this is a very technical, jargon-filled headline that most people will not understand, except people who work in that field, which is ecology, for example. The other end of the spectrum is using sensationalist sort of taglines. So this can be entertaining, concise, sensationalist, oversimplified, and hyperbolic. This is accessible, this is easily understandable by people, but it's inaccurate in terms of the science, right? So the headline for this could be the new dinosaur age, reptiles win the race, right? So this is not scientifically accurate. It does not tell what the research is about, and it's very hyperbolic and sensationalist, right? So this is not ideal either, right? The third version of this is basically a balance between the science and the story aspect, which is a yin yang, which is an Eastern philosophy way of looking at balance in the world. So you can actually craft your science story about your science in a way that it's accurate, it's objective, it's concise, clear, but it's also absorbable, inspiring, original, accessible, entertaining, engaging, right? So this is both accessible and accurate. And an example of a headline could be the locomotory edge, how a slow and steady gait benefits the most unlikely of species, right? Now, this is much more scientifically accurate. It's also much more interesting to read, and people might actually read it, right? So what I'm trying to say through this slide is that there has to be a balance between what's accurate and what's objective. What's interesting and what's accurate, and you need to bring these two together. And you, as the scientist, are the best person to decide what is accurate but also engaging, right? So that's the message of this slide. Right. So I want to share a new definition of SciComm that I came across somewhere, and I sort of liked it a lot. So this definition says that science communication is a process of distilling the most salient information from a complex body of work into the most concise and compelling story possible for a given audience, right? So it's distilling the information, which is concise and compelling. So there is accuracy here, there is engagement here, and then there is connect here, right? With the audience, right? So I think I really like this definition, and I think it's something that I want you guys to take back with you. When you think of science communication, it should be a process of distilling the most important information into the most compelling story for a given audience, right? Lastly, you come across this joke within scientific circles that the plural of anecdote is not data, right? So a lot of scientists say that you cannot just cite anecdotes and treat it as data, because data has to be collected in a systematic way where it's reproducible and it can be repeatable and reproducible. So there is this saying among scientists which says the plural of anecdote is not data. But I have something else to say instead of this, right? So I'm saying that the plural of anecdote could perhaps be engaging science communication if you choose to use the proper anecdotes, if you choose to structure them in a proper format, and if you use a right chronology of events, right? So a plural of anecdote could actually be engaging science communication. And this is something I want to leave you guys with this thought. So with that, I think I've come to the end of my presentation. Before we finish and before I sort of conclude, I want you to do this exercise again. I want you to go to menti.com and use a different code this time, which is 3051742. And answer the same questions, but I just want to see if there's a difference between what you had said before and what you feel now, right? So if we can take another minute to do this, and then I'll conclude. Right? Most people seem to be done. All right. So I see that the scores have increased from 7.9 and 6.6 to 8.1 and 8.8, which is great. I feel validated suddenly. Great. All right. So if we are done with that, I'll move on. So before I say goodbye and I start taking questions, I want to sort of plug in something that I do and which is very relevant to what we're talking about today. So there is this collective called SciCommSci, which stands for the Science of Science Communication that I run. It's basically a forum for discussing and engaging with evidence-based ways of science communication. And we try to get practitioners of science communication with researchers in science communication together. And we discuss about what are the best ways of doing science communication, which is backed with research in social sciences, right? So you can find out more about us at bit.ly/SciCommSci, or you can reach out to us on Twitter at @SciCommSci. Just to tell you a little bit about what we do, we have monthly talks where we talk about topics like science education, science policy, science art, science in India, science communication models. We also have a mentorship session where we offer free mentorship for anybody trying to do any form of science communication. So there's Mohit Kumar Jolly, who was yesterday's speaker, and me. So we speak to SciComm people who are doing SciComm, and we give them feedback on how to improve their science communication. And recently, we also wrote a science communication policy for India, which we submitted to the Science Technology Innovation Policy 2020 India. So these are some of the things that we do at the club. And if you would be interested in joining our session, we have a session at the end of this month. If you would be interested, please do visit our website and do join us. And with that, I would like to thank all of you very much. Thanks a lot to all the people at the organizing team of Pravega for giving me this opportunity. And I would also like to thank the Simon Center, NCBS, TFR, and the Simons Foundation, which basically funds me and my profile at NCBS. And with that, I come to an end. Thank you so much, guys.